In this chapter, we're going to look at several really key elements or attributes of video. Now, I'm not sharing these with you so you could have this kind of like beard scratching moment where you feel superior and know all about the ins and outs of video. I'm sharing these things with you because oftentimes when you have trouble and you're troubleshooting with your videos, something doesn't look right, something's not working correctly, it's often because of these attributes of video. So knowing this is really indispensable. Let's look at this example here. We have here some footage. If I click on this, we can see that the footage is 1280 pixels by 1080 pixels, also referred to as 1080. If I click on our sequence is also 1280 by 1080. But for some reason, when I look at the footage that I brought into the sequence and I click it to activate it, I can see that there's actually more footage on the sides. How can that possibly be? Because my sequence is the same number of pixels. And something also screwy with this video. When I open this up in Adobe Bridge, it actually seems squished. It actually kind of compresses the video. So what is the problem? Why is this piece of footage so weird? The answer lies in its pixel aspect ratio. On any piece of video footage or on any computer image, if we zoom in far enough, we'll see these little tiny squares that make up images on our computer. And these little squares are the building blocks of what we do here. And these little squares are called pixels. That's short for picture elements. Now on a computer, these little squares are just that. They're square, as equally wide as they are tall. But on a television set and the way that some cameras record footage, those pixels are not square. They are a little bit more wide or a little bit more tall. So I'm going to take this magnification back to fit here. And what's happening is that we are not using the correct pixel aspect ratio in this sequence. We could tell the pixel aspect ratio by this number in parentheses here. So our sequence, the pixel aspect ratio is 1.0, meaning that the width and the height are the same proportions. So it's a square. So 1.0 means square pixel aspect ratio. But if we click on our footage, you see that the pixel aspect ratio is 1.5. In other words, that the width of the pixels are 1.5 times wider than the height of the pixels. So even though we're dealing with the exact same number of pixels, the sizes of the pixels are what are causing the differences between the sequence and the footage. So what I'd want to do is create a new sequence here, go down to the bottom, this new icon, click on sequence. And I know that this is DVC Pro HD footage. It's DVC Pro HD and then 1080p. And if we select this, we can see that the settings are 1280 by 1080 with a 1.5 pixel aspect ratio. This is what we want. Select this preset in the DVC Pro HD 1080p folder and go ahead and click OK. And now when I put this footage inside of this sequence, it looks perfect. This is also why sometimes when you give footage from sources like this that have weird pixel aspect ratios to another program or to a client or something, and let's say here in Bridge where it's expecting a 1.0 or square pixel aspect ratio, it has to squish all this stuff in to fit in the 1280 by 1080 spot. And of course, it's meant to have a wider pixel aspect ratio than just square, and so it appears squished. So oftentimes, if you're watching a low-budget production, they're not mindful of pixel aspect ratios, then it will appear a little bit squashed or a little bit stretched out. Now, another trick you can use to get around this is if you notice that we have basically an HD footage here, but HD, as we'll learn about later in this chapter, is really 1920 by 1080, not 1280 by 1080. But the thing is that 1920 by 1080 with a square pixel aspect ratio is about the same as 1280 by 1080 with a 1.5 pixel aspect ratio. Let me show you what I mean here. I'm going to go to the sequence here. I'm going to click New Sequence, another new sequence. This time I'm going to go to Digital SLR, and I'm going to go to 1080p, and I'm going to go to 1080p 24, and this is True HD, 1920 by 1080 with the square pixel aspect ratio. I'm going to go ahead and click OK here, and when I bring in this footage and bring this in here, then it matches. So really, 1280 by 1080 with a 1.5 pixel aspect ratio is the same thing as 1920 by 1080 with a square pixel aspect ratio. And if all you get out of this movie is that sometimes pixel aspect ratios can make things look stretched or squished, then that is what you really need to understand out of this. Sometimes cameras play around with their pixel aspect ratios so they can get away with having a smaller sensor and recording this much footage and stretching out the pixel aspect ratio to compensate for it. So you're actually getting the same amount of information, just kind of in a different way. So just be mindful as you're going forward and creating sequences and working your projects that pixel dimensions are not the only key ingredient to getting the right size of your sequence.